Lesbian Feminist Criticism of Caroline Gonda. So Dr. Caroline Gonda is a college associate professor and has been a fellow director of studies in English at St. Catherine since 1996. She has also published essays and articles on British 18th century and romantic literature and culture, on literature and sexuality, and on lesbian feminist criticism and theory. According to Dr. Caroline, any historical accounts of lesbian feminist criticism must sooner or later grapple with the myth of origins. So the myth itself is not always the same, but certain features remain constant. So she began by invoking Laura Dowan's keynote address to the International Lesbian Life Conference in Dublin 2004, a conference marking 10 years of lesbian life studies and activism since the publication of Dowan's critical anthology, The Lesbian Postmodern. So, Dowan emphasized the need to create a new genealogical model of lesbian studies and to dislodge what she called this and now calcified origin narrative. So, the narrative of lesbian feminism collision with and defeat by queer theory. Linda Garber and Paulina Palmer voiced their dissent from this dominant narrative on the same day in the conference, pointing out the unacknowledged connection between lesbian feminist thought and queer theory, and the injustice of the narrative stereotypes. Queer theory as sexy, vital, pluralistic, and fun. Lesbian feminism as the opposite. In 1994, 10 years earlier, Kathleen Martindale, The Story of How the Americans' Feminist Sex Wars Over Sexual Representation in the Early 1980s, created lesbian category trouble, broke up the feminist consensus, realigned lesbians with gay men, and then brought forth the new skid of the book, Lesbian Postmodernism. Farewell in the year 1996, the monster error, a powerful but slow-moving beast, conquered by theoretical sophistication. So Crete, in 1991, on the other hand, stated the conflict is also presented as an intergenerational one, the story of queer daughters rebelling against maternal sexual repression. So whatever these myths of origin see as the conquering hero or rebel, they agree on what has been defeated or displaced. Lesbian feminism as a mother monster or monolith, that is to say, they take for granted the origins of lesbian feminist criticism in a particular late 20th century historical moment and political movement. Criticism shaped by lesbian and feminist concerns predates the rise of second-wave feminism, and lesbian feminism emerges from it. So this earlier criticism is sometimes overlooked because of its origin outside the academy. Though some recent account, for example, of it is Barrett and Kramer in the year 1997, also Martindale, Schuster, 1998, Castle, 2003, have acknowledged the importance of key figures. Jeanette H. Foster encyclopedic work on the representation of lesbian and lesbianism from antiquity to the mid-20th century as sex-variant women in literature. So this is a work of immense scholarship and erudition, the result of 40 years independent research with extensive coverage of literature in English, French, and German. So Foster's book was published at her own expense after a frightened university press refused to honor its contract, and subsequently reprinted by feminist and lesbian presses. Much early, lesbian feminist criticism was concerned to identify literary lesbians and lesbianism, lesbian authors, lesbian texts, lesbian characters, or lesbian images, to borrow the title of Jane's Rules' 1975 book, Jane's Rules, Lesbian Images Gains Power Over Representation by Analyzing It. So, Marlene Schuster notes, that rules dual perspective as lesbian novelist and lesbian reader is the book's strength. In that book, as in her own fiction, Rule was charting new territory, reading as a writer but also as a lesbian, looking for stories that would help her map what it means for a woman to love a woman and to articulate that desire in language. In lesbian feminist literary criticism, as in traditional literary criticism, many of the most significant theories has been poets or writers of fiction themselves, namely Adrienne Rich, Audre Lorde, Jane Rule, Judy Grant, Gloria Anzaldúa, Nicole Brossard-Gillian, Hans Combe, and Zuniti Namjoski, Judith Barrington, and Patricia Dunkter. So Betsy Werland's collection, Inversion, writing by dykes, queers, and lesbians, is a prime example of the interplay between creative and critical lesbian feminist writing, and also of the importance of the personal and the autobiographical in lesbian feminist criticism. However, lesbian feminism would come under attack in the 1980s for its failures to take account of class and racial differences, so as well as for its doctrinaire stance on sexual practices. So the question of lesbian feminist criticism's relationship to other genres and disciplines has been a complex one, made more so by the importance of practitioner critique and text, or ended between critic and author can become blurred as can the boundaries between different genres. Salvaggio notes that in Alice Parker writing on Nicole Brossard, as in the writing of other lesbian critics and theories, theory bends towards autobiography and prose fiction. It can be hard to know what it is that lesbian feminist critics really want to be writing. So in attempts to define the boundaries of lesbian literature and criticism have come from novelists, according to Harris, as well as the academics, from poets to academic past, or without, from journalists and campaigners and makes gay politician movement, and from professors of women's studies. So, lesbian feminist criticism may be something enabled by the academy, since the freedom conferred by tenure as essential to her lesbian feminist criticism writing, or carried on necessarily outside it, even in oppositions to it. The rise of lesbian and gay studies and queer studies departments and courses has in the U.S. especially raised questions of where academically lesbian feminist criticism belongs. That's according to Zimmerman in the year 1996. So lesbian feminist criticism has had to work out its relationship to other disciplines, including history, philosophy, and cultural studies, as well as to the other forms and schools of criticism and critical theory, including mainstream feminist criticism, gay and lesbian studies, queer theory, post-structuralism, performance theory, and postmodernism. So lesbian feminist criticism has been profoundly influenced by some essays which do not focus especially on literary texts and which are themselves political as much as literary. According to Adrienne Rich, compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence is Adrienne Rich, compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence is perhaps the most obvious example of this. However, the rise of high theory in the late 1980s and the 1990s produced a tendency to classify these works as activism rather than theory. Linda Garber contests the hierarchical placing of theory above poetry as theory. What counts as a literature or theory and what the focus of criticism should be are questions which have exercised lesbian criticism from its early days. So by the beginning of the 1990s, some critics were already noting the emergence of a lesbian canon with all the narrowing of focus and hardening of orthodoxes which canon's formation entails. Paradoxically, even as a lesbian canon was emerging, lesbian feminist criticism was struggling with questions of definition. Anna Marie Jogos notes the same questions keeps recurring. What is a lesbian fiction? So Castle rearticulates what's almost a decade earlier Zimmerman identified as a special question for lesbian critics. Anna Marie Jogos notes the same question, when is a lesbian text? So Dorothy Allison recalls Bertha Harris' declaration that there is no such thing as a lesbian novel. Dorothy Allison recalls Bertha Harris' declaration that there is no such thing as a lesbian novel because no female books ever ran off with other little female books. So Palma Palmer notes in her writing notes, regretfully, lesbian feminist critics' preference for producing reading against the grain of high art and canonical literature rather than attending to explicitly lesbian writing. Bonnie Zimmerman notes the impact of lesbian fiction of readers' desire for something accessible, entertaining, and just correct enough to be a bit bland. Political and aesthetic judgment, it seems, are unlikely to tally, and lesbian feminist criticism may vary dramatically in its sense of what makes something worthwhile as an object to study. So two pieces of the same collection present a striking contrast in this respect. Are Diane Harmer essays on the 1950s lesbian pulp novels of Anne Bannon and Gillian Sprague's analysis of love poetry of Sylvia Townsend Warner and Valentine Auckland. These two contrasting essays foreshadow the territorial struggle between the claims of poetry and narrative as a proper objects of feminist critical study. Paula Bennett, whose war on Emily Dickinson Paula Bennett, whose won on Emily Dickinson as lesbian poet, has completely transformed Dickinson's studies, argues that poetry is the literary genre in which lesbian writers have flourished and to which they have contributed the most. Despite some important work on articular poets and on the lesbian poetic tradition, and despite some collection which includes poetry, narrative, and more rarely, drama, lesbian feminist criticism has tended to focus more on narrative than on poetry. In 1996, the year after Bennett's essay on U.S. lesbian poetry, 3 books devoted to narrative appeared. Julie Abraham's Are Girls Necessary? Lesbian Writing and Modern Histories, Marlene Farwell's Heterosexual Plots and Lesbian Narratives, and Judith Roofkamp's As You Are, Sexuality and Narrative. So Abraham and Farwell both engage with a problem already outlined by Bennett, the marriage plot and the difficulty of escaping the institutionalization of heterosexuality in prose fiction. These ways include privileging female bonding and breaking up male bonding, using sexual sameness to disrupt the gender oppositions between active and passive, which opens structured narrative and undermining the authority of traditional narrative, for example, by using multiple plots and voices. Noting the tendency of lesbian feminist criticism on narrative to focus either on formally traditional work or on experimental ones. Recent lesbian feminist criticism has sought to move beyond the antagonist view of lesbian feminism and queer theory and to acknowledge the connection between the two. The scope of lesbian feminist criticism now includes for more than the lesbian canon through particular periods, and authors may continue to attract the lion's share of critical attention. There is a lively interest in popular culture and genre fiction, as well as in visual media. The historical and textual focus on lesbian feminist criticism nevertheless remains strong as it has been from the first. The relationship between historical and textual consideration has not been an easy one. However, disciplinary boundary between literature and history have seen numerous border skirmishes over the function of literary text as historical evidence material for close reading or both. So the desire to establish an historical as well. The desire to establish an historical as well as the literary tradition of lesbianism, a genealogy of record of our existence, has also been problematized by the difficulty of reading and interpreting works from earlier periods. Alison Hannigan in the 1980s is one of the earliest British attempts to grapple with this difficulty, and lesbian feminist criticism notes how often critics and social historians have dismissed the lesbian implications of pre-20th century exchanges between women by appealing to changes in linguistic, emotional, and physical conventions. Whatever we pose, Prudians might think it doesn't mean that. So the meaning of romantic friendship explored so extensively by Lillian Federman in Surpassing the Love of Man have been especially problematic. Federman works asserts a continuous tradition of women loving women, but like rich notion of lesbian continuum, it has been criticized both for essentialism and for desexing lesbianism. So with Brett, lesbian history took a fresh turn with the discovery and publication of coded but sexually explicit 19th century diaries by the Yorkshire Harris and Lester. The link between the sexual practices and sexual identity remains problematic. Havelock Ellis asked in Lesbian Sexual Identity, a Modern Invention, socially constructed through the work of sexologists such as Havelock Ellis. Where there, as Terry Castle mischievously formulates it, no lesbian before the 1900s was there, as Emma Donoghue passions between women suggest something we can recognize as British lesbian culture in the 17th and 18th centuries, and what role can be the evidence of literature play in all of this. Recent historical lesbian feminist criticisms has often turned to discourse analysis for the solution of these difficulties. So Valerie Traub analyzes lesbian and lesbianism as rhetorical effects in modern England, while Susanne Lancer argues for a reading of the Suffolk body as transgressive text. Anthologies and collections both of Aces and other writings have been a significant place in lesbian feminism criticism. Their importance reflects the collectivity of lesbian feminist endeavor, but also the need to collect information, types of representation, ways of thinking about lesbianism over a wide historical span. These recent anthologies, especially those by Federman, Hannigan, and the Castle, represent a return to some lesbian feminist criticism's earliest concerns to the search for the lesbian in literature and the literature of lesbianisms rather than lesbian literature. Like the anthologies by Donoghue and Spraggs, they also represent a return to lesbian feminist criticism origins in personal quests and treasure maps, and in years of passionate and curious reading. The range of publishers involved from Columbia University Press to Penguin, British trade publishers, Hamish Hamilton, and Ford States, and to the women's press suggests that in its oldest form, lesbian feminist criticism is still alive and will both in and out of the academy, which as it should be. Those are the illustrations of the predates in the rise of the lesbian feminist criticism of Dr. Caroline Gunda.